You probably think a 72-year-old woman should be knitting blankets for her grandchildren, not loading a 12-gauge shotgun on a Tuesday morning. But you have never stood on land that has your blood mixed into the soil. You do not know the weight of it. They call this place God's country. But let me tell you, the devil has been trying to buy a condo here for 40 years. His name is Damian Cross, and he thinks his Silicon Valley billions can buy my mountain. He thinks I am just a tired old widow ready to cash out and move to Florida. But he forgot one thing. I am a Galloway. And on this ranch, we do not sell. We reload. The morning air in the valley was so cold, it felt like swallowing glass. That is the thing about Montana in October. It does not ask for your permission to freeze you. It just takes the heat right out of your bones. I adjusted the collar of my shearling coat and tightened my grip on the reins. My horse, Rusty, is a quarter horse I have had for 15 years, and he was dancing a little sideways because the frost was biting at his hooves too. I told him to settle down and patted his neck. The steam rising off his coat smelled like wet wool and sweat, and it is a smell I prefer to most expensive perfumes. We were up on the North Ridge checking the fence line. The herd was down in the lower pasture huddled together against the wind. 500 head of Black Angus cattle. To a banker, they look like assets on a balance sheet, but to me, they look like survival. They look like the tuition I paid for my son Jackson to go to law school, and the roof I put over my head after my husband died. The valley was quiet. It is usually so quiet up here, you can hear a hawk screaming from a mile away. But then I heard it. It started as a low whine, like a mosquito buzzing right in your ear, but louder, much louder. Rusty pinned his ears back and snorted. I looked up into the gray sky and shielded my eyes against the pale sun. There it was, a drone. It was not one of those toys kids play with in the park. This was a commercial rig, sleek and black with 4 rotors and a camera lens that looked like a giant unblinking eye. It was hovering directly over my prize bull, just 50 feet off the ground. My stomach turned. I knew exactly who it belonged to. I nudged Rusty forward and he scrambled up the shale, loose rock clattering down the slope. The drone pivoted. It saw me. It turned that glass eye right toward my face and hovered there. It felt invasive. It felt like someone peeping through my bedroom window. I did not think. I just reacted. I reached into the leather scabbard tied to my saddle and pulled out the Remington. It is heavy and scarred from years of use, but the action is as smooth as butter. I cracked it open to check the shells and snapped it shut. The drone dipped lower, almost taunting me. I raised the stock to my shoulder and took a breath. I let the breath out slowly, just like my father taught me 60 years ago. The boom echoed off the canyon walls like a cannon shot. For a second, nothing happened. Then the buzzing stopped. The black machine shuddered in the air like a bird having a heart attack, and then dropped like a stone. It smashed into a limestone outcrop about 30 yards away and shattered into plastic confetti. I lowered the gun. The silence rushed back into the valley, and it was beautiful. I rode down to the wreckage. It was smoking a little. I did not get off my horse. I just spat on the ground next to it and turned Rusty around. By the time I got back to the main ranch house, the dust was already kicking up on the driveway. An electric SUV was winding its way up the gravel road. It was silent and silver and looked like a spaceship parked next to my rusted Ford pickup. I stayed on my horse. I wanted the height advantage. The car door opened and Damian Cross stepped out. He is a handsome man if you like men who look like they have never done a day of manual labor in their lives. He was wearing a vest that probably cost more than my tractor and designer hiking boots that were spotlessly clean. He looked at me and flashed a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He said, Augusta, I believe you just shot down about $5,000 worth of my property. I looked down at him. I rested the shotgun across my saddle horn. I said, Damian, in this state, anything flying that low over private livestock is considered a predator. I was just protecting the herd. He laughed. It was a dry sound, like dry leaves scraping together. He walked closer, and Rusty sidestepped nervously. Damian held up a hand. He said, You are a firecracker, Augusta. I always said that. Look, I did not come here to fight about toys. I came here to save you. I stared at him. I said, I do not need saving. He shook his head and looked around at the barn, which I admit needs a fresh coat of paint, and the fences, which are leaning a little to the left. He said, Be realistic. The bank is circling. The beef market is down. You are drowning out here all alone. I am offering you a lifeline. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek blue envelope. He walked over and tucked it into my saddlebag before I could stop him. He said, That is a formal offer. It is 20% above market value. It is enough to clear your debts, buy a nice condo in Phoenix, and never worry about freezing pipes or calving season ever again. I felt the heat rising up my neck. It wasn't the money. It was the audacity. He looked at my land like it was a blank canvas waiting for his paint. He wanted to pave over the pastures where I buried my husband. He wanted to put glamping pods where my grandfather built the first cabin. I pulled the envelope out of the bag. The paper felt thick and expensive. I said, You want to build a resort, Damian? You want to bring 1,000 tourists up here to trample the sagebrush and drink lattes and pretend they are cowboys? He shrugged. He said, It is called Progress, Augusta. The world is changing. You cannot hold back the tide. I looked at the envelope. I looked at the mountains rising up purple and majestic behind the house. I said, This land is not a commodity, Damian. It is a legacy. My grandfather died for this dirt. My husband died working this dirt. And I intend to die on this dirt too. I ripped the envelope in half. The sound was loud in the quiet air. I ripped it again and let the pieces flutter down onto his shiny, clean boots. I said, Get off my property. And tell your drone pilot if he comes back, I will switch to buckshot and I will not aim for the machine. Damian's smile vanished. His eyes went cold and hard, like polished agates. He stepped back and looked at me with something that looked a lot like pity, but felt a lot like a threat. He said, You are making a mistake, Augusta. A very expensive mistake. The bank is not as patient as I am, and neither is the future. He got back in his silent silver car and reversed down the drive. I watched him go until the dust settled. I sat there on my horse for a long time. My hands were shaking a little, but not from the cold. I knew he was right about one thing. The bank was circling. I had 30 days to come up with money I did not have. But as I looked out over the valley with the sun starting to dip behind the peaks, I knew one thing for sure. This was going to be a war. And I was already outnumbered. I drove my '99 Ford F-350 into town, and the suspension squeaked over every pothole like a chorus of angry crickets. I love this truck. It smells like diesel fuel and stale coffee and wet dog, and to me, that is the smell of honest work. But parking it on Main Street these days feels like parking a tank in a butterfly garden. Bozeman has changed. When I was a girl, this street was lined with hardware stores and saddle makers, and a diner where you could get a steak and eggs for $3. Now it is all boutique yoga studios and high-end coffee shops that sell oat milk lattes for $8 and art galleries selling paintings of cowboys to people who have never touched a cow. It made my teeth ache just looking at it. I pulled up in front of First Montana Bank. It is a sturdy brick building that has stood on the corner since the gold rush days. I have been banking here since I was 18. Frank Miller, the branch manager, has known me since I was knee-high. He was the one who approved the loan for the new barn when everyone else said I was crazy to expand. I needed to talk to Frank. I needed him to tell me that Damian Cross was just blowing smoke and that my mortgage was solid. I walked inside and stopped dead in my tracks. The lobby was different. The heavy oak desks were gone. The warm yellow lighting was gone. It had been replaced by sleek glass cubicles and harsh white LED lights that made everyone look pale and sick. The smell of old paper and peppermint candies was gone too, replaced by a sterile lemon cleaner smell that stung my nose. I walked up to the teller. She was a young girl with bright purple hair and a nose ring. She didn't look up from her computer screen. I cleared my throat. I said, "I am here to see Frank Miller." She tapped on her keyboard and popped her gum. She said, "Mr. Miller retired 3 months ago." My heart skipped a beat. Retired? Frank never said a word. He would have called me. We played bridge together on Thursdays. I said, "Who is running the branch then?" She pointed a long, manicured finger toward the corner office. The glass door was closed. The name on the plaque said, Preston Hayes. I did not knock. I just opened the door and walked in. Preston Hayes looked up. He was young, maybe 30. He was wearing a suit that was too tight and a watch that was too big. He had the kind of haircut that cost more than a ton of hay. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He said, "Mrs. Galloway, I presume. Please have a seat." I did not sit. I stood there clutching my purse with my knuckles turning white. I said, "Where is Frank?" Preston sighed and clasped his hands on the desk. He said Frank decided to enjoy his golden years in Arizona. Corporate brought me in to modernize our portfolio. We are reviewing all our legacy accounts. I did not like the way he said legacy. He made it sound like a disease. I said, "I am not a portfolio Preston. I am a customer. I have been with this bank for 50 years. I have never missed a payment. Not once." He nodded and clicked his mouse. He stared at his screen and hummed a little tune. It was infuriating. He said, "That is true, Mrs. Galloway. Your payment history is exemplary. However, the agricultural sector is extremely volatile right now. And given the recent fluctuations in beef prices and the age of your infrastructure, the bank has reassessed the risk level of your loan." I felt a cold prickle of sweat down my back. I said, "What are you talking about?" He turned the screen around so I could see it. It was a lot of numbers and charts that meant nothing to me. But then he pointed to a paragraph in fine print at the bottom of a document. He said, "This is the demand clause. It is standard in all commercial agricultural loans. It allows the bank to call in the full balance of the principal if the collateral value drops below a certain threshold." My ears started ringing. I leaned forward and placed my hands on his cold glass desk. I said, "My land is the collateral, and land prices in this valley are skyrocketing. You know that." He smiled that shark smile again. He said, "Residential land is skyrocketing, Mrs. Galloway. But agricultural land with outdated facilities and declining revenue is a liability. We had an independent appraiser out there last week. He valued the ranch significantly lower than your outstanding debt." I remembered the drone. I remembered the surveyor truck I saw parked on the county road. It was all connected. I said, "You cannot do this." He said, "It is already done. We are invoking the clause. You have 30 days to pay the outstanding balance of $2.1 million. If you cannot, we will be forced to initiate foreclosure proceedings." The room spun. $2 million. I had maybe $12,000 in the checking account, and the cattle auction wasn't until November. I whispered, "You are working with him, aren't you?" "You are working with Damian Cross." Preston's face went blank. He picked up a pen and tapped it on the desk. He said, "Who I have lunch with is none of your business, Mrs. Galloway. But if I were you, I would consider selling." I hear there is a very generous cash offer on the table. It would solve all your problems. The rage flared up in my chest, hot and bright. I wanted to reach across the desk and grab him by his silk tie. I wanted to drag him out to the ranch and make him pull a calf in a blizzard so he could understand what that land was really worth. But I didn't. I straightened my back. I adjusted my coat. I looked him dead in the eye. I said, "You tell your friend Damian that he better bring a bigger checkbook. And you better bring an army if you plan on taking my keys." I turned around and walked out. I held my head high until I got to the truck. I climbed inside and slammed the door. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't get the key in the ignition. I dropped my head against the steering wheel and let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. 30 days. I was alone. The bank was gone. The law was against me. I needed help. I needed a shark of my own. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper with a phone number on it. I hadn't called it in 5 years. Not since the Christmas argument. Not since he told me he hated the ranch and everything it stood for. I stared at the number. Jackson. I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and dialed. The phone rang 4 times before it went to voicemail. I listened to his recorded voice telling me he was either in court or in a meeting and to leave a brief message. His voice sounded different than I remembered. Deeper and polished like smooth stones in a river. It lacked the rough edges of a boy who grew up drinking well water and breathing dust. I did not leave a message. I hung up and stared at the dashboard of my truck. I felt like a fool. Of course he would not answer. He is a partner at a big firm in Seattle now. He deals with corporate mergers and intellectual property disputes. He does not deal with foreclosure notices on cattle ranches in the middle of nowhere. I started the truck and drove home. The drive usually clears my head, but today every fence post looked like an accusation. Every mile of barbed wire reminded me of how much work needed to be done and how little money there was to do it. When I got back to the house, I went into the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. I waited an hour. Then I dialed again. This time he picked up on the second ring. He said, "Mother, is everything all right?" He did not say hello. He went straight to the disaster check. That is how it is with us. He assumes if I am calling someone must be dead or the barn must be on fire. I gripped the phone cord. I still have a landline on the kitchen wall because cell service is spotty in the canyon. I said, "Jackson, I need you to come home." There was a silence on the other end. A long, heavy silence. I could hear the faint typing of a keyboard in the background. He said, "I am in the middle of a massive case right now. I cannot just drop everything and fly to Montana. What is going on?" I took a deep breath. I told him about the drone. I told him about Damian Cross. I told him about the bank calling the loan and the 30-day deadline. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I think a little bit of the fear leaked through. When I finished, he did not explode. He did not get angry on my behalf. He just sighed. It was a tired sound. He said, "I told you this would happen eventually. You are trying to run a 20th century business in a 21st century economy. The margins do not work." I felt a flash of irritation. I said, "I did not call you for a lecture, Jackson. I called you because you are a lawyer. You know how these sharks operate. I need you to look at the paperwork. I need you to find a loophole or a stay of execution or something to buy me time." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Send me the documents. I will look them over tonight." I said, "No. I need you here. They are playing dirty. They are sabotaging the equipment. I need someone I can trust on the ground." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. He said, "You want me to come play cowboy again? You know I hate it there." I looked out the window at the sun setting over the ridge, turning the sky into a bruise of purple and gold. I said, It is your inheritance, Jackson. If I lose this place, there is nothing left. No legacy, no land, nothing to pass down to you or your children if you ever have them. That stopped him. I knew it would. Jackson is a pragmatist. He might hate the ranch, but he understands the value of assets. He said, "Fine. I can clear my schedule for a few days. I will fly into Bozeman tomorrow morning." But Mother, do not expect a miracle. If the bank has invoked the demand clause, there is usually no way out. We might have to look at other options. I did not ask what those other options were. I was just relieved he was coming. I spent the next day cleaning the house like the Queen of England was visiting. I dusted his old room, which is still exactly the way he left it when he went to college. The high school football trophies on the shelf. The poster of the vintage Mustang on the wall. The bedspread with the faded rodeo print. I wanted him to remember who he was. I wanted him to remember where he came from. I heard the car before I saw it. It was not a truck. It was a rented sedan, low to the ground and shiny black. It looked ridiculous, bumping over the cattle guard. I walked out onto the porch, wiping my hands on my apron. I felt nervous. A mother should not feel nervous to see her own son. But Jackson has a way of making me feel small. He makes me feel like a country bumpkin who doesn't understand how the real world works. He stepped out of the car. He was wearing a gray suit and no tie. He looked tired. His face was pale, and he had gray circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't seen the sun in a month. He walked up the steps and gave me a stiff hug. He smelled like expensive cologne and airplane air. He said, "You look good, Mother." I said, "You look like you need a steak and a week of sleep." He pulled away and looked around the yard. He looked at the peeling paint on the barn. He looked at the rusted tractor sitting by the shed. He wrinkled his nose. He said, "The place has really gone downhill." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, but I ignored it. I said, "That is why I need you. Come inside." I made a pot roast. We sat at the kitchen table and ate in silence for a while. The old grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. It was the only sound in the house. Finally, he pushed his plate away and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a legal pad and a pen. He said, "Okay, let's be realistic." I looked up the filings before I left Seattle. The bank has you dead to rights. The contract is ironclad, and Damian Cross has a team of 50 lawyers on retainer. I put down my fork. I said, "So that is it. You drove all this way to tell me to give up." He leaned forward. His eyes were intense. He said, "I am telling you to be smart. Cross made you an offer." I saw the amount in the brief. "It is a lot of money, Mother. It is enough to pay off the bank and set you up for life. And it would give me a nice nest egg to start my own firm." There it was, the truth. I looked at him. I looked at the son I raised, the boy I taught to ride and shoot and fish. And I realized he was not looking at me. He was looking at the numbers in his head. I said, "This is not about money, Jackson. It is about blood. This land has been in our family for 4 generations. We do not sell out just because things get hard." He slammed his hand on the table. It made the silverware jump. He said, "It is not hard, Mother. It is over. The ranch is dead. You are just too stubborn to bury it." I stood up. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark shape of the mountains. I said, "I am not selling. And if you are not here to help me fight, then you can sleep in the barn." He sighed and rubbed his temples. He softened his voice. He said, "Look, I am sorry. I am just tired. Let me look at the papers. Maybe there is something we missed. Maybe there is a technicality. But you have to promise me that if we can't find a way out, you will consider the offer." I did not answer him. I just nodded. But as I watched him pull out his laptop and start typing, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I had prayed for a savior. But looking at my son in his gray suit with his hungry eyes, I had a terrible feeling I had just let the wolf in the front door. I woke up before the alarm. That has been happening a lot lately. When you owe the bank $2 million, sleep becomes a luxury you cannot afford. It was 4 a.m, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the wind rattling the loose sash in the hallway window. Jackson was asleep in the guest room. I could hear his soft snoring through the wall. It was a sound I remembered from when he was a boy, and it gave me a strange pang of comfort mixed with dread. He was here, but he wasn't really here. He was just passing through, looking for an exit strategy. I made coffee strong enough to strip paint and walked out to the porch. It was still dark, but there was a sliver of moon hanging over the jagged teeth of the Bridger Mountains. I pulled on my boots and my canvas jacket. I had a bad feeling in my gut. Call it intuition, or call it the paranoia of an old woman under siege, but I felt like something was wrong. I drove the truck down to the lower pasture where the heifers were grazing. These are my best breeding stock. They are the future of the herd. If I lose them, I lose the next 3 years of revenue. I parked by the fence and killed the engine. Usually at this hour the cattle are up and moving, grazing on the dew-soaked grass. But the field was still. Too still. I climbed through the barbed wire and walked into the dark. I used my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the sagebrush. I found the first one near the creek. She was lying on her side, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her eyes were rolled back, showing the whites, and there was a thick white foam dripping from her muzzle. She tried to lift her head when she saw the light, but she was too weak. She let out a low moan that sounded like a child crying. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knelt down and touched her flank. She was feverish hot to the touch. I ran to the next one. Same thing. Down. Foaming. Shaking. There were 5 of them. 5 of my best heifers poisoned. I did not panic. Panic is for people who live in cities. On a ranch, panic gets you killed or bankrupt. I ran back to the truck and grabbed the medical kit. I gave them each a shot of atropine, hoping it was just a localized toxin, maybe some bad weeds they ate. But deep down, I knew. Cattle are smart eaters. They do not eat poison weeds unless they are starving, and these girls had plenty of good grass. I walked over to the creek. The water looked black and oily in the flashlight beam. I dipped my hand in and brought it to my nose. It did not smell like mountain water. It did not smell like mud or fish. It smelled like bleach and gasoline. It smelled chemical, sharp and artificial. I followed the creek upstream. I walked for a mile, my boots crunching on the frozen mud. I followed the water all the way to the north fence line, the boundary between my land and the national forest. Or at least it used to be the national forest. Now it was the staging ground for Terra Nova resorts. I found it just inside my fence line, a plastic drum 55 gallons tipped on its side in the brush. It was hidden behind a cluster of willows, but the cap had been unscrewed. A steady trickle of clear, viscous liquid was oozing out of it and running down the bank into the water. I shined my light on the drum. There were no markings, no warning labels, just a plain blue barrel dumped exactly where it would do the most damage. I stood there for a long time. The sun was starting to come up, painting the sky in violent shades of red and orange. I looked at that barrel and I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. This wasn't just business. This was evil. They were trying to kill my animals to devalue the land. They wanted to turn my ranch into a toxic waste dump so the bank would have no choice but to foreclose and sell it cheap. I took pictures with my phone. I took a sample of the liquid in an empty water bottle I had in my jacket. Then I kicked the barrel upright to stop the flow and rolled it away from the water. I drove back to the house fast. The truck bounced and skidded on the gravel. When I walked into the kitchen, Jackson was sitting at the table drinking coffee and looking at his phone. He looked fresh and clean in his pressed shirt. I slammed the water bottle down on the table. The liquid inside sloshed menacingly. I said, "Smell that." Jackson jumped. He looked at the bottle and then at me. He saw the mud on my boots and the wild look in my eyes. He said, "Good morning to you too, Mother. What is this?" I said, "It is poison, Jackson. I found 5 heifers down in the lower pasture, foaming at the mouth. Someone dumped a chemical drum in the creek right at the property line." He frowned and picked up the bottle. He unscrewed the cap and sniffed it gingerly. He wrinkled his nose. He said, "It smells like solvent, maybe industrial cleaner." I said, "It is sabotage. It is Damian Cross. He is poisoning the water to kill the herd and drive down the appraisal value. It is the oldest trick in the book." Jackson set the bottle down and wiped his hands on a napkin. He looked at me with that pitying expression again, the one that made me want to scream. He said, "Mother, slow down. You are making a massive leap. Just because you found some trash in the creek does not mean there is a conspiracy." I stared at him. "I said I found a 50-gallon drum, Jackson. Not a soda can. A drum. Someone hauled it up there. Someone unscrewed the cap. It was deliberate." He sighed and leaned back in his chair. He crossed his arms. He said, "Look, I know you are stressed. I know you are looking for a villain, but Cross is a billionaire CEO running a publicly traded company. He does not sneak around in the bushes dumping toxic waste. He has too much to lose. It was probably just some kids, or maybe illegal dumpers trying to save a dumping fee." I felt the blood rushing to my face. I said, "You are defending him." He said, "I am thinking like a lawyer, Mother. You have no proof. You have a bottle of dirty water and a sick cow. If you go to the sheriff with this without hard evidence, Cross will sue you for defamation, and he will win." I pointed a finger at him. My hand was shaking. I said, "You do not know these people. You have been away too long. You think the world plays by the rules you learned in your fancy law school. But out here, the only rule is survival." Jackson stood up. He looked frustrated. He said, "I am trying to help you, but you have to be rational. We need to focus on the bank. We need to focus on the contract. Chasing conspiracy theories about poisoned water is a waste of time." I grabbed the bottle off the table. I screwed the cap on tight. I said, "Fine. You focus on the paper. I will focus on the land, because if those cows die, Jackson, there is no ranch left to save, and there is no inheritance for you to sell." I turned around and walked out. I slammed the screen door behind me. I went back to the barn and loaded the shotgun. I put it in the rack in the truck. Then I drove back down to the pasture. I sat there in the truck watching the vet work on the heifers. He managed to save 3 of them. 2 died. I watched the backhoe dig the grave. It is a terrible thing to see a machine dig a hole for an animal you raised from a calf. It tears a piece out of you. I sat there, and I watched the tree line. I knew they were out there, Cross's men, watching me, waiting for me to break. But they did not know Augusta Galloway. They did not know that grief does not break me. It hardens me. I looked at the fresh mound of earth. I said, "You want to fight, Damian? You got one." But as I drove back to the house, I looked at the light in the guest room window where Jackson was working, and I realized the scariest part wasn't the enemy in the woods. It was the doubt sitting at my kitchen table. The attic of the ranch house is a place where time goes to sit down and rest. It smells of cedar shavings and mothballs and the dry, sweet scent of old paper that has been baking under the roof shingles for a century. The rain had started falling around noon, a steady gray drizzle that turned the yard into soup and drummed a relentless rhythm on the tin roof. It was the kind of weather that makes your joints ache and your mind wander to the past. I was up there on my hands and knees digging through stacks of bankers' boxes. Jackson had sent me on a scavenger hunt. He wanted tax returns from 1995. He wanted the original deed of trust. He wanted grazing permits and water adjudication filings. He said he needed to build a paper trail to see if there were any technicalities we could use to stall the bank. I knew it was busy work. He was just trying to keep me occupied while he negotiated the terms of my surrender on his cell phone downstairs. I could hear his voice drifting up through the floorboards, muffled and reasonable. He was probably talking to Preston Hayes, or maybe even Damian Cross's lawyers. He was probably talking about exit strategies and liquidation. I pushed a stack of National Geographic magazines aside and pulled a heavy wooden sea chest out from under the eaves. It belonged to my grandfather, Silas Galloway. He was the one who staked this claim back in 1902. He came out here from Pennsylvania with nothing but a mule and a Bible and a head full of dreams about the open range. I hadn't opened this chest in years. The latch was stiff with rust, but it popped open with a groan. Inside it was a treasure trove of useless things that meant everything to me. A pair of silver spurs, buffalo hide coat that was shedding hair, a handful of arrowheads he found in the creek, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was his journal. I picked it up. The leather cover was cracked and stained with sweat and maybe a little blood. I sat back on my heels and opened it. The pages were yellow and brittle like dry leaves. My grandfather had beautiful handwriting, tight, precise cursive that looked like lace on the page. I started reading random entries. He wrote about the brutal winter of 1906 when they lost half the herd. He wrote about the day he met my grandmother at a dance in Bozeman. Then I turned to a page dated August 14, 1902. There was a hand-drawn map folded into the spine of the book. I unfolded it carefully, terrified it would disintegrate in my hands. It was a map of the valley, but not the way it looks now. There were no roads, no power lines, just the creeks and the ridges and the property lines drawn in black ink. There was a red circle drawn around the upper basin, the exact spot where my house stands today. And underneath the map, glued to the page, was a document I had never seen before. It wasn't a standard deed. It was a water rights agreement signed by the territorial governor. I squinted to read the faded ink. The legal language was archaic, but clear. To Silas Galloway and his heirs in perpetuity is granted the exclusive and senior rights to the subterranean aquifer located beneath the North Ridge Basin, including all subsurface flows extending to the valley floor. I read it again. Then I read it a third time. My heart started to thump hard against my ribs. I know water law. In the West, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. Water rights are gold, but usually they apply to surface water, the creeks, the rivers. This deed granted us rights to the aquifer, the underground reservoir. I looked at the map again. I traced the blue line my grandfather had drawn showing the flow of the underground water. It started under my ranch. It flowed deep under the limestone cap and drained down into the lower valley. The lower valley. That was where Damian Cross was building his resort. I sat there in the dusty attic, and the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind. Cross did not want my land for the view. He didn't care about the grazing. He didn't even really care about the access road. He needed the water. He was building an eco-luxury resort. That meant swimming pools. That meant spas. That meant 18-hole golf courses that needed to be watered every single day in a high desert climate. But the surface creeks in the valley were already over-allocated to other ranchers. There was no water left to buy, unless he tapped the aquifer. But he couldn't tap the aquifer, because I owned it. My grandfather had locked it up over 100 years ago. If Cross drilled a well down in the valley, he would be stealing my water. And with this piece of paper, I could stop him. I could shut off his tap before he even turned it on. Without that water, his billion-dollar resort was just a pile of dry lumber in the dirt. That was why he offered me 20% over market value. That was why he was sabotaging my herd. He was terrified. He needed me gone before I realized what I was sitting on. I wasn't poor. I was holding the winning lottery ticket. I just hadn't scratched it yet. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat. It was a wild sound. I clutched the journal to my chest and rocked back and forth. I stood up. My knees popped, but I didn't feel the pain. I felt 10 feet tall. I walked to the attic stairs. I was going to march down there and shove this map in Jackson's face. I was going to show him that his mother wasn't a senile old fool. I was going to show him that the Galloway legacy was worth more than his entire law firm. I got to the top of the landing and stopped. I could hear Jackson talking downstairs. He must have put the phone on speaker because I could hear the other voice too. It was a smooth voice. Slippery. It was Damian Cross. I froze. I held my breath. Jackson said, "Look, Damian, I am working on her. She is stubborn. You know that." Cross said, "I am running out of patience, Jackson. The investors are getting nervous. I need that title clear by the end of the month." Jackson said, "I know. I am looking at the financials now. She is underwater. Once the bank moves on the foreclosure, she won't have a choice. I can convince her that selling to you is the only way to save her dignity." Cross laughed. He said, "Good. You are doing the right thing. Just get her to sign. There is a bonus in it for you if you close this before the snow flies." Jackson said, "I do not want the bonus for me. I just want her out of this mess. I want her safe in a condo where she can't hurt herself." Cross said, "We both want what is best for Augusta. Keep me posted." The line clicked dead. I stood there in the shadows of the hallway. The journal felt heavy in my hand, like a stone. Jackson wasn't just skeptical. He was talking to the enemy. He was coordinating with him. I felt a crack in my heart that was deeper than the one in the Liberty Bell. My own son, my flesh and blood. He wasn't fighting for me. He was managing me. He was brokering my defeat because he thought I was too old and too stupid to know what was good for me. I looked at the document in my hand. The ink from 1902 seemed to glow. If I showed this to Jackson now, what would he do? Would he use it to fight Cross? Or would he hand it over to him to secure a bigger payout? Would he burn it to save me? I realized with a cold clarity that I could not trust him. I could not trust anyone. I backed away from the stairs. I moved quietly, my socks sliding on the wood floor. I went back into the attic. I found an old metal cash box under a pile of quilts. I put the journal and the map inside it. I locked it. Then I pried up a loose floorboard in the corner behind the chimney and hid the box underneath the insulation. I hammered the board back down with the heel of my boot. I wiped the dust off my face. I composed my features. I put on the mask of the tired, defeated old woman they all thought I was. Then I walked down the stairs. Jackson was in the kitchen typing on his laptop. He looked up when I came in. He looked guilty for a split second, then he smiled. He said, "Find anything useful up there, Mother?" I looked at him. I lied right to his face without blinking. I said no. Just dust and mothballs. Just old memories, Jackson. Nothing that can save us now. He nodded and looked relieved. He said, "That is what I thought. Come sit down. We need to talk about the transition plan." I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I said, "Tell me about the plan, Jackson." But in my head, I was already planning a war. I had the ammunition now. I just needed to wait until I could see the whites of their eyes. The silence in the house was suffocating. It was a thick, heavy blanket that made it hard to breathe. I spent the morning avoiding Jackson, pretending to sort through laundry while my mind was racing like a wild horse in a chute. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't fight Damian Cross alone, and I couldn't fight him with lawyers. I needed an army. I needed my neighbors. There was a town hall meeting scheduled for 7 o'clock at the Grange Hall. It was supposed to be about the new county waste management levies, but I intended to hijack the microphone. I was going to tell the other ranchers about the water. I was going to tell the Johnsons and the Millers and the old widow Kovich that Cross wasn't just coming for my land, he was coming to suck the valley dry. If I could get them riled up, if I could get them to form a coalition, we might stand a chance. I waited until Jackson was on a conference call in the dining room. I could hear him using words like leverage and liquidation. I grabbed my keys off the hook and slipped out the back door. The air outside was crisp and smelled of coming snow. The clouds were low and heavy, scraping the tops of the pines. I walked to the truck. My old Ford F-350 looked like a beast sitting there covered in mud and road salt. I patted the hood. It was the only thing on this ranch I still fully trusted. I climbed in and turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life with a familiar rattle that vibrated through the seat. I let it idle for a minute, warming up the glow plugs. I was halfway down the driveway when I saw Jackson running out onto the porch. He was waving his arms. He looked small in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop. I pretended I didn't see him. I wasn't ready to lie to his face again, not yet. I turned onto the county road. It is a treacherous stretch of asphalt that winds down the canyon following the twists of the Gallatin River. On one side, you have a sheer rock wall rising up 500 feet. On the other side, you have a drop-off into the river, which was running high and black with snowmelt. We call the sharpest curve the Devil's Elbow because it has claimed more tourists than I can count. I took it slow. I had plenty of time. I turned on the radio to the local AM station. They were playing an old Hank Williams song about heartache and lonesome whistles. It felt appropriate. I was thinking about what I would say at the meeting. I was practicing my speech in my head. I would tell them about the drone. I would tell them about the poisoned heifers. I wouldn't mention the deed, not yet. That was my ace in the hole, and I wasn't showing it until the pot was right. I came around a bend and saw the sign for the Devil's Elbow ahead. The road drops at a 10% grade right before the turn. I took my foot off the accelerator and let gravity take over. The speedometer crept up. 40, 45, 50. I moved my foot to the brake pedal to scrub off some speed. I pressed down. The pedal went all the way to the floor. It hit the mat with a hollow thump. There was no resistance, no grab, no friction. My stomach dropped out of my body. It felt like I was falling in a dream. I pumped the pedal frantically. Down, up, down, up. Nothing. The truck was free, wheeling a 3-ton missile, picking up speed on the ice. 55. 60. The curve was coming up fast. The guardrail looked like a toothpick from here. Beyond it was nothing but air and the freezing river. I didn't scream. I didn't have time to scream. My hands clamped onto the steering wheel so hard, I thought the plastic would crack. I grabbed the emergency brake lever and yanked it hard. There was a snap, and the cable went slack in my hand. They had cut that too. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't mechanical failure. It was murder. I had 2 seconds to make a choice. If I tried to make the turn at this speed, I would roll the truck and go over the edge. If I stayed on the road, I would punch through the rail and go over the edge. I looked to the right, the ditch. It was deep and filled with crusted snow and jagged limestone rocks. It was suicide, but it was better than the river. I shouted a prayer that was mostly a curse and cranked the wheel hard to the right. The truck left the pavement. The noise was deafening. The tires screamed as they lost traction. Then the suspension slammed into the ditch. The windshield exploded into a million diamonds as the hood buckled. The airbag detonated in my face, like a punch from a prizefighter, filling the cab with white dust and the smell of burning chemicals. The world went upside down. Metal screamed against rock. I felt a violent jolt that snapped my head back, and then everything stopped. Silence. I was hanging in my seatbelt. The truck was on its side, wedged against the canyon wall. The engine was ticking as it cooled. The Hank Williams song was still playing softly from the cracked dashboard speakers. I tried to move. My shoulder screamed in protest. My face felt wet and sticky. I reached up and touched my forehead. Blood. But I was awake. I could wiggle my toes. I fumbled for the seatbelt release. It clicked, and I fell sideways onto the passenger door, which was now the floor. I kicked at the shattered windshield until a hole opened up big enough for me to crawl through. I dragged myself out into the cold air. The snow was cold against my cheek. I lay there for a minute, gasping for breath, watching the steam rise from the wrecked engine. I should be dead. I knew that. I forced myself to stand up. The world swayed, but I locked my knees. I limped around to the back of the truck. I knelt down in the mud and looked at the rear axle. The hydraulic line for the brakes was dangling loose. Fluid was dripping onto the white snow, creating a pink slush. I looked closer. The rubber hose hadn't burst. It was a clean cut, smooth and precise. Someone had taken a pair of wire cutters to it. I stood up and wiped the blood out of my eyes. I looked back up the road toward the ranch. Someone had been under my truck. Someone had crawled into my barn while I was sleeping, or while I was in the attic and severed the lines. Was it Cross's men? Did they sneak past the dogs? Or was it someone who was already inside the house? I thought about Jackson. I thought about how he tried to stop me from leaving. I thought about how he insisted on driving me everywhere since he arrived. A wave of nausea hit me that had nothing to do with the crash. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked, but it still had a signal. My thumb hovered over the emergency number, but I didn't dial 911. If the sheriff came, he would file a report. It would be public record. Cross would know he failed. He would try again. I needed him to think I was dead or incapacitated. I needed the element of surprise. I dialed the only person left in this valley I could trust, a man who hated Damian Cross almost as much as I did. I dialed the number for the Grange Hall. I said, "Listen to me carefully. This is Augusta Galloway. Do not hang up." I looked at my wrecked truck, my loyal companion twisted and broken in the ditch. I said, "I am going to be a little late to the meeting. But do not start without me. I have something to show you." I started walking. It was 3 miles to the hall. My shoulder was throbbing and blood was dripping down my nose, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt the fire. I walked for a mile before headlights cut through the darkness behind me. It was Hank Miller in his rusted-out plow truck. He stopped when he saw me, limping on the shoulder, blood drying on my forehead and my coat torn at the shoulder. He rolled down the window, his eyes going wide. He said, "Augusta, what in the hell happened?" I climbed into the cab. It smelled of wet dog and tobacco. The most comforting smell in the world right now. I told him I slid off the road. I didn't tell him about the cut lines. Not yet. I told him to take me back to the ranch, not the hospital. He argued, but nobody wins an argument with Augusta Galloway, even when she is bleeding. When we turned into my driveway, I told him to kill the lights. I told him to drop me at the bottom of the hill and wait. I walked the last 100 yards in the dark. The house was blazing with light. Every window was glowing. It looked like a ship on a dark ocean. I went to the back door, the mudroom entrance that squeaks if you don't lift the handle just right. I lifted it perfectly. I slipped inside and stood in the shadows of the laundry room, listening. I expected to hear Jackson pacing. I expected to hear him calling the sheriff, worried sick that his mother hadn't come home. Instead, I heard the creak of floorboards overhead, in the attic. My stomach twisted. I took off my boots so I was in my wool socks. I crept through the kitchen, past the silent phone, and up the stairs. My hip was throbbing with every step, a dull fire that radiated down my leg, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I reached the landing. The attic door was open. A beam of light cut across the hallway dust. I moved closer, pressing my back against the wall. I peered around the doorframe. Jackson was on his knees. He had a crowbar from the tool shed next to him. The loose floorboard behind the chimney, the one I had nailed down only 2 days ago, was pried up. The metal cash box was open on his lap. He was holding the journal. He was holding the map. I watched my son reading the words of his great-grandfather. I saw his eyes scanning the water adjudication deed. I saw the moment the realization hit him. His eyes widened. He sat back on his heels and let out a low whistle. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call me. He didn't call the police. He dialed a number. He said, "Damian." "It's me." I felt like I had been slapped. The air left my lungs. He listened for a moment, then spoke again. His voice was trembling, not with fear, but with greed. The same excitement he used to get when he won a football game. He said, "You were right to worry. She has leverage, massive leverage. I found the original 1902 filings. She owns the aquifer, Damian. She owns the whole damn water table." Pause. He said, "No, she doesn't know what it's worth. She thinks it's just sentimental trash. She hid it under the floor." Liar. He knew I knew. He knew I was fighting for it. He stood up, clutching the documents like they were the Holy Grail. He said, "Listen to me. The price just went up. If you want this file to disappear, if you want me to bury this deep enough that no court in Montana will ever find it, I want double the buyout, and I want a seat on the Terra Nova board." He listened again, then smiled. It was a smile I didn't recognize. It was cold and calculating. He said, "I'm leaving now. I'll meet you at the field office in 20 minutes. Bring the paperwork." He hung up. He shoved the deed and the map into his leather satchel. He kicked the empty cash box back into the hole and pushed the floorboard down with his foot. He turned toward the door. I moved fast, faster than an old woman should be able to move. I ducked into the linen closet across the hall and pulled the door almost shut, leaving a sliver of a crack. Jackson walked past me. He was humming. He walked down the stairs, his steps light and bouncy. I heard the front door open and close. I heard the beep of his car unlocking. I heard the engine start and the tires crunching on the gravel as he sped away. I stepped out of the closet. I walked into the attic. I looked at the hole in the floor. It looked like a grave. He wasn't just selling the land. He was selling the history. He was selling the water that kept this valley alive. And he was doing it for a board seat and a check he would blow on cars and condos in Seattle. I went to the window and watched his taillights disappear down the canyon road. I didn't cry. I think I had run out of tears a long time ago. I went downstairs to the gun cabinet. I took the key from the hidden hook behind the calendar. I unlocked the glass door. I didn't take a gun. Jackson was my son. I couldn't shoot him. God help me. I couldn't do it. But I took the box of shells, and I took the spare set of keys to the tractor. I walked back out to the darkness where Hank was waiting in his truck. I opened the passenger door. He looked at me. He saw the look on my face. It must have been terrifying because he put his cigarette out instantly. He said, "What's the plan, Augusta?" I looked toward the lights of the Terra Nova field office, glowing like a sore on the other side of the valley. I said, "Drive, Hank. We are going to crash a party." He put the truck in gear. I stared out the windshield. The pain in my shoulder was gone. It was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Jackson thought I was a confused old woman who needed to be managed. He thought I was sentimental. He forgot that I was the one who taught him how to play poker. He forgot that on a ranch, you don't show your hand until the betting is done. He had the deed, but he didn't have the ranch. Not yet, and he didn't know that the dead woman was coming for him. The Terra Nova field office sat on a graded plateau overlooking the valley like a shiny white blister on the skin of the mountain. It was a cluster of high-tech modular trailers surrounded by floodlights that turned the night into a harsh surgical noon. Generators hummed with a low throbbing vibration that you could feel in your teeth. It was an encampment of an invading army disguised as a development corporation. Hank stopped the plow truck at the edge of the gravel lot. He reached under his seat and pulled out a tire iron. He looked at me with his jaw set tight. He said, "I am coming in with you, Augusta. I am not letting you walk into that den of vipers alone." I put my hand on his arm. My hand was shaking, but my voice was steady. I said, "No, Hank. If you go in there with a weapon, they will call the police and arrest us both for assault. This is not a fist fight. It is a chess match. And I need to move the pieces myself. You stay here. Keep the engine running. If I am not out in 20 minutes, you drive this truck right through the front wall." He looked at me for a long second, then he nodded slowly. He said, "You are a scary woman, Augusta Galloway." I opened the door and stepped down into the mud. The wind was whipping across the open ground, stinging the cut on my forehead. I did not wipe the blood away. I wanted them to see it. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a woman who had crawled out of her own grave. I walked past the rows of parked company trucks. I walked past a security guard who was too busy looking at his phone to notice the battered old woman limping toward the command trailer. I reached the metal stairs. I took a breath that rattled in my bruised chest. I gripped the railing and pulled myself up. I did not knock. I threw the door open with every ounce of strength I had left. It banged against the wall with a crack like a gunshot. The room inside was warm and smelled of fresh coffee and expensive cologne. There was a large map of my ranch pinned to the wall with red pins marking the demolition sites. Damian Cross was sitting behind a large desk, leaning back in a leather chair. Jackson was standing in front of him holding a glass of amber liquid. The leather satchel was open on the desk between them. The deed, my grandfather's deed, was spread out on the surface under the bright lights. They both froze. Jackson dropped his glass. It hit the carpet with a dull thud and splashed whiskey over his polished shoes. He turned pale. He looked at my torn coat. He looked at the blood drying on my face. He looked at the mud caked on my knees. He whispered, "Mother." Damian Cross did not look frightened. He looked annoyed. He sat up and adjusted his cuffs. He said, "You have a bad habit of trespassing, Mrs. Galloway. And you look terrible. Did you have an accident?" I stepped into the room and kicked the door shut behind me. The sound made Jackson flinch. I walked straight to the desk. I did not look at my son. If I looked at him, I might have slapped him, or I might have wept, and I could not afford to do either. I kept my eyes locked on Damian Cross. I said, "It was not an accident, Damian, and you know it. Cutting brake lines is a messy way to do business. Even for you." Jackson made a choking sound. He looked at Damian. He said, "Brake lines? What is she talking about? You said you were just going to pressure her." Damian ignored him. He looked at me with cold reptilian eyes. He said, "That is a very serious accusation, Augusta. I hope you have proof, because if you are implying that my company had anything to do with your reckless driving, I will sue you for slander before you can get a bandage on that head." I laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. I leaned over the desk, placing my muddy hands on his pristine blotter. I said, "You can sue all you want, but right now we are going to talk about water." I looked down at the deed. The yellowed paper looked fragile under the fluorescent lights. I said, "I see you found the paperwork. I see my son decided to cash in his inheritance early." Jackson stepped forward. His voice was high and defensive. He said, "Mother, listen to me. It is over. I made a deal. A good deal. Damian is going to give us double the appraisal plus a seat on the board. We can save the family name. We can start a foundation. This piece of paper is the only leverage we had, and I used it to save us." I turned to him then. I looked at the boy I had carried in my womb, the boy I had nursed through fevers, the boy I had taught to ride. I said, "You stole from me, Jackson. You broke into my house and you stole the history of this family to buy yourself a condo in Seattle. Do not talk to me about saving the name. You just sold it." He shrank back. He couldn't meet my gaze. Damian picked up the deed. He held it up to the light, admiring the watermark. He said, "It is a fascinating document. Truly, granting exclusive aquifer rights in perpetuity. It would have been a nightmare for my legal team. It would have tied up the project for years. But now that I have the original, I think we can consider the matter closed. Without this document, you have no claim. The county records from 1902 were destroyed in a fire in the 30s. You know that. This was the only proof." He smiled and reached for a lighter on his desk. He flicked the flame to life. He said, "It is time to let the past burn, Augusta." He moved the flame toward the corner of the paper. I did not lung for it. I did not scream. I just leaned back against the doorframe and crossed my arms. I said, "Go ahead. Burn it." Damian paused. The flame wavered. He looked at me suspicious of my calm. I said, "You really think I am that stupid, don't you? You think I am just a doddering old woman who keeps the only copy of a billion-dollar asset in a cardboard box in the attic?" I shook my head slowly. I said, "Jackson knows me better than that. Or he used to." "Jackson, tell him." What is the first rule I taught you about poker? Jackson looked at me. He was sweating now. He said, never show your hand until the river card. I nodded. I said I found that deed 3 days ago, Damian. Not yesterday. 3 days ago. Do you know what I did? I drove to Helena. I met with the state attorney general. I met with the Water Rights Adjudication Board. We certified the document. We scanned it. We filed it into the state digital archive. I pointed at the paper in his hand. I said, that thing you are holding is just a piece of paper. It is a souvenir. The legal claim is already in the system. It is already flagged. If you burn that, you are just burning kindling. But if you try to break ground on that resort, the state will shut you down so fast your head will spin. You are not fighting me anymore, Damian. You are fighting the state of Montana. The room went deadly silent. The hum of the generator seemed to get louder. Damian lowered the lighter. The flame snapped out. He looked at the deed, and then he looked at me. He was trying to read my face, trying to see if I was bluffing. But I have been playing poker with cattle buyers and grain merchants for 50 years. My face was a mask of stone. He looked at Jackson. His voice was a low growl. He said, is she telling the truth? Jackson looked terrified. He looked from me to Damian. He said, I do not know. She was gone all day Tuesday. She said she was going to the vet, but she was gone for 8 hours. Helena is a 3-hour drive. It was a lie. I had been at the vet. But Jackson didn't know that. His own guilt was filling in the blanks. Damian slammed the deed down on the desk. His face turned a dark, ugly red. He said, you played me. I smiled. It hurt my face, but I smiled anyway. I said I did not play you, Damian. I beat you. The water is mine. The land is mine. And now I have something else. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I held it up. I said I recorded the last 5 minutes. I recorded my son confessing to stealing the document. I recorded you threatening to burn evidence. And I am pretty sure if the sheriff looks at the underside of my truck, he is going to find tool marks on the brake lines that match the tools in your maintenance shed. I stepped away from the door. I said I am going to the Grange Hall now. I am going to play this recording for the entire town. And then I am going to the police. Damian stood up. He looked like he wanted to come over the desk and strangle me. He said, you are bluffing. You have nothing. I opened the door. The cold wind rushed in, swirling the papers on the desk. I said, try me. I looked at Jackson one last time. He was slumped against the wall, looking like a broken man. I said, you made your choice, Jackson. I hope the bonus was worth it. I walked out. I walked down the metal stairs, my legs shaking so hard I thought I would fall. I walked back to the plow truck where Hank was waiting. I climbed in and slammed the door. Hank looked at me. He saw the fire in my eyes. He said, did you get him? I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. I said, I bought us some time, Hank. I bought us maybe 24 hours. But God help me. I just played the biggest bluff of my life. Hank put the truck in gear. He said, you mean you didn't file the papers in Helena? I opened my eyes and looked at the dark road ahead. I said, I never left the ranch on Tuesday, Hank. I was birthing a calf. That paper on his desk was the only copy in the world. And if he realizes that before tomorrow morning, we are dead. Hank let out a low whistle. He said, then we better drive fast. I nodded. We roared out of the lot, leaving the white blister of the field office behind us. I had won the hand, but the game wasn't over. And now, Damian Cross knew I was dangerous. He wouldn't send a drone next time. He wouldn't send a lawyer. He would send a war. The Grange Hall is the heart of this valley. It is where we vote, and where we marry, and where we mourn our dead. It is a simple white clapboard building with a wood stove in the corner that smokes when the wind blows from the north. When Hank pulled the plow truck up to the front steps, the parking lot was already full of pickups. I could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass windows. I told Hank to wait in the truck. He wanted to argue, but he looked at my face and decided against it. I took a minute to look at myself in the side mirror. The blood on my forehead had dried into a dark crust. My hair was wild. My coat was torn. I looked like a ghost that had clawed its way out of the earth. Good. Let them see it. I walked up the steps. My leg was dragging a little now. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Damian was wearing off, and the pain from the crash was coming back in waves. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. The room went silent. There were about 50 people inside sitting on metal folding chairs. They were my neighbors. People I had known for 40 years. There was Old Man Miller, who runs the feed store. There was Sarah Jenkins, who delivers the mail. They were drinking coffee and complaining about the snow. When they saw me, the coffee cups stopped halfway to their mouths. I walked to the front of the room. I did not limp. I forced myself to walk straight. I climbed the 3 steps to the low stage and stood behind the podium. I gripped the wood to stop my hands from shaking. I said, "I am sorry I am late. I had some trouble on the road." Someone gasped. Sarah Jenkins stood up and said, "Augusta, you are bleeding. We need to call a doctor." I held up a hand. I said, "Sit down, Sarah. I do not need a doctor. I need an army." I looked out at the faces. These were good people, but they were tired. They were struggling. I knew Damian Cross had been making offers to them too, buying up water rights, buying up easements, promising them a golden ticket out of the hard life of ranching. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I plugged it into the auxiliary cord of the ancient sound system they used for calling bingo numbers. I said, "You all know Damian Cross. You know his shiny suits and his shiny promises. He tells you he wants to bring jobs. He tells you he wants to save the valley." I pressed the play button. The voice of Damian Cross boomed through the speakers. Distorted and crackly, but unmistakable. "If you want this file to disappear, if you want me to bury this deep enough that no court in Montana will ever find it." Then the voice of my son, my Jackson. "I want double the buyout, and I want a seat on the Terra Nova board." I watched the faces in the room. I saw the confusion turn to shock. I saw the shock turn to anger. They heard the part about the brake lines. They heard the part about burning the evidence. I stopped the recording. The silence in the room was heavy. It was the kind of silence that comes before a thunderstorm. I said, "That was recorded 20 minutes ago. My son Jackson sold us out. He sold the water from under our feet, and Damian Cross tried to kill me to keep it quiet." I leaned into the microphone. I said, "They are not building a resort. They are building a drain. They are going to suck the aquifer dry to water their golf courses while your wells turn to dust, and they are willing to kill an old woman to do it." A low murmur started in the room. Men were standing up. Hats were being pulled down tight. Then the doors at the back of the hall banged open. Jackson stood there. He was out of breath. His suit was disheveled. He must have driven like a maniac to catch up to me. He looked wild, desperate. He shouted, "Don't listen to her." Every head in the room turned. Jackson walked down the center aisle. He looked sweating and pale. He said, "She is confused. She was in a car accident. She has a head injury. She doesn't know what she is saying. That recording is out of context. We were negotiating a settlement to save the ranch. He stopped at the foot of the stage. He looked up at me. His eyes were pleading. He said, "Mother, please. Come down from there. We need to get you to a hospital. You are not well." I looked down at him. For a moment, I didn't see the man in the suit. I saw the little boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee. I saw the teenager who helped me fix the fences in the summer. I felt an ache in my chest that was sharper than any broken bone. But then I looked at his hands. Soft hands. Hands that had never worked the soil. Hands that had just tried to sign away my life. I spoke into the microphone. My voice did not shake. I said, "You are right, Jackson. I am hurt. I am bleeding because your business partner cut my brake lines." Jackson flinched. He looked around the room. He saw the hostility in the eyes of the men standing near the walls. He realized he had lost the crowd. He lowered his voice to a whisper only I could hear. He said, "Mother, stop this. Cross knows." He checked the online registry. He knows the file is empty. He knows you bluffed. He is coming, Mother. He is bringing the private security team. You have to leave. Now. My heart stopped. The bluff had lasted less than an hour. I looked at Jackson. I saw the fear in his eyes. Was he afraid for me, or was he afraid for his bonus? I honestly couldn't tell anymore. I stepped away from the podium. I walked down the stairs until I was standing face to face with him. I said, "Let him come." Jackson reached for my arm. He said, "You are being insane. They will destroy you." I pulled my arm away. I looked him dead in the eye. I said, "Go back to Seattle, Jackson." He froze. He said, "What?" I said, "Go back to your glass tower. Go back to your mergers and your acquisitions. Get off my land. Get out of this valley." He stared at me. He said, "I am your son." I shook my head. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, cutting a track through the dried blood. I said, "My son died a long time ago. He died the day he forgot where he came from. You are just a lawyer for a land developer, and you are trespassing." I turned my back on him. I looked at the crowd. I said, "Cross is coming. He is coming for the deed, and he is coming for me. If anyone wants to leave, I won't blame you. This isn't your fight." Old Man Miller stood up. He is 80 years old and walks with a cane, but he stood up straight. He said, "Augusta, I have been buying hay from you for 40 years. If Cross wants to come up that road, he is going to have to go through my truck first." Another man stood up. Then another. I looked back at the door. Jackson was gone. He had slipped out into the night like a shadow. I was an orphan now. I had no husband. I had no son. But as I looked around the room at the weathered faces of my neighbors, I realized I wasn't alone. I nodded to Hank, who was standing by the door holding a tire iron. I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let's go home. We have a ranch to defend." The convoy looked like a funeral procession moving in reverse. My battered plow truck led the way, followed by 10 dusty pickups, a couple of Jeeps, and even Sarah Jenkins' Subaru. We wound our way up the canyon road, a river of yellow headlights cutting through the black Montana night. My shoulder was throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache, and the adrenaline that had carried me through the town hall was starting to curdle into exhaustion. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Hank drove with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel. He kept checking the rearview mirror. He said, "They are behind us, Augusta, about 2 miles back. I can see the lights. Fast movers." I looked back. Far down the valley floor, I saw them. 4 distinct sets of blue-white LED headlights. They moved with a precision that didn't belong on these dirt roads. They moved like predators. I said, "Get us to the gate, Hank. We need to close the choke point." The entrance to the Galloway Ranch is marked by a heavy timber archway my husband built 30 years ago. It sits at a narrow point in the canyon where the road is squeezed between a limestone cliff and the drop-off to the creek. It is the only way in and the only way out. We skidded to a halt just past the cattle guard. I jumped out. My knees buckled, but I caught myself on the fender. I shouted, "Block it! Park them nose to nose!" The neighbors didn't hesitate. They knew what a siege looked like. Old Man Miller parked his heavy dually truck sideways across the cattle guard. Two other trucks pulled in behind him, creating a wall of steel and rubber 3 vehicles deep. Men jumped out of cabs carrying hunting rifles and tire irons. They weren't soldiers. They were fathers and grandfathers in Carhartt jackets. But they stood shoulder to shoulder in the headlights, their breath steaming in the cold air. I limped to the front of the barricade. I held my grandfather's shotgun. It wasn't loaded. I had left the shells in the house, but they didn't know that. The blue-white lights swept around the final curve. 4 black SUVs roared up the incline. They were massive, armored beasts with brush guards and tinted windows. They slowed down when they saw the wall of trucks, but they didn't stop until they were 20 feet away. The doors opened. Men spilled out. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing tactical gear. Black vests, combat boots, radios clipped to their shoulders. They didn't carry hunting rifles. They carried assault-style weapons held at the low ready. Contractors. That's the polite word for mercenaries. A man stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was built like a vending machine, square and thick. He had a crew cut and a scar running through his eyebrow. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like he broke things for a living. He held up a megaphone. He said, "This is a private security detail for Terra Nova Resorts. You are illegally blocking a public easement. Clear the road immediately, or we will forcibly remove these vehicles." I stepped forward, past the bumper of Miller's truck. I stood alone in the glare of their headlights. I yelled back without a megaphone. My voice echoed off the canyon walls. I said, "There is no easement here. This is private property, and you are trespassing on a working cattle ranch." The commander lowered the megaphone. He walked forward until he was 10 feet from me. He looked at the shotgun in my hands and smirked. He said, "Mrs. Galloway, we know the gun isn't loaded. We know your son took the shells." My stomach turned. Jackson. He had told them everything. He had given them the tactical layout of the house. The commander continued. He said, "We have a court order authorizing us to secure the water infrastructure pending the litigation regarding the deed. We are coming through." He signaled to his men. 2 of them moved toward the winch on the front of their SUV. They were going to hook up to Miller's truck and drag it out of the way. I heard the distinct clack-clack of actions being cycled behind me. I looked back. Hank had leveled his deer rifle. Old Man Miller had a pistol. Sarah Jenkins was holding a flare gun. Hank yelled, "If you touch that truck, I will put a .30-06 round through your engine block." The security team raised their weapons instantly. Red laser dots danced across the chests of my neighbors. The air froze. It was the moment before the lightning strikes. One twitch, one accidental trigger pull, and there would be a massacre on my driveway. I screamed, "Stop!" I raised my hands. I couldn't let my neighbors die for my dirt. I said, "Nobody shoots." The commander smiled. He thought he had won. But then the rear door of the second SUV opened. Damian Cross stepped out. He was wearing a heavy cashmere coat over his suit. He looked out of place in the mud and the tension, like a vampire visiting a graveyard. He walked up next to his commander. He looked at me. He looked at the blockade. He looked at the laser sights painting the chests of the townspeople. He said, "Impressive, Augusta. I didn't think you had this many friends left. I spat on the ground near his expensive loafers. I said, "You are a coward, Damian, hiding behind hired guns." He shrugged. He said, "I am a businessman, and right now, business is concluded. We know the deed is in the house. We know you didn't file it in Helena. You tried to bluff a bluffer." He turned to the commander. He said, "Don't shoot them. It's bad PR. If we kill a bunch of locals, the press will have a field day." The commander looked confused. He said, "So we retreat?" Damian laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound. He said, "No. We wait." He pointed to the narrow canyon walls surrounding us. He said, "There is only one way out of here. We block the road. We cut the power lines. We jam the cell signals. We sit here and we wait." He looked back at me, his eyes gleaming. He said, "It is going to get very cold tonight, Augusta. And I know your propane tank is low. I saw the delivery schedule. How long can you last? 2 days? 3? He turned back to his men. He said, "Set up a perimeter. Nothing goes in. No food, no fuel, no water trucks. And certainly no lawyers. We don't need to burn the house down. We just need to freeze them out." The security team lowered their weapons. They began to deploy, moving with military efficiency to block the road and set up positions on the ridges overlooking the house. My heart hammered. A siege. He was going to starve us out. I looked at Hank. He looked terrified. He whispered, "Augusta, we can't fight a siege. We have old folks here. We have no supplies." Damian walked back to his SUV. Before he got in, he turned one last time. He shouted, "You have 1 hour to bring me the deed, Augusta. If you do, everyone goes home safe. If not, well, winter is coming early." He slammed the door. The SUVs backed up and parked horizontally across the road, blocking us in completely. High-intensity floodlights popped on, blinding us, turning the driveway into a prison yard. I turned to my neighbors. They looked small and frightened in the harsh light. They had come for a fight, not a slow death by freezing. I lowered my shotgun. I said, "Get back to the main house. Everyone inside." We boarded up the windows. We retreated. It was a bitter walk back up the hill. The wind was picking up, howling through the pines. When we got inside, the house felt fragile. The walls that had sheltered 4 generations of Galloways suddenly felt like cardboard. I went to the kitchen. I checked the pantry. We had some canned beans, some flour, a few pounds of frozen venison. Enough for maybe 2 days with this many people. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. And then the house went dark. He had cut the line. A collective gasp went through the room. The only light came from the fireplace and the terrifying white glare of the floodlights coming through the windows. I stood by the window, peering out at the enemy encampment at the bottom of the hill. Hank came up beside me. He lit a kerosene lamp. The yellow light cast long, dancing shadows on his face. He said, "We are trapped, Augusta. We have no phones, no power, no way to call for help. He has won." I touched the bandage on my forehead. I felt the shape of the deed folded in my back pocket. I looked at the black shape of the mountains. I said, "He hasn't won yet, Hank. He made one mistake." Hank looked at me. He said, "What mistake?" I turned from the window. The plan was forming in my mind. It was desperate. It was crazy. But it was the only card left to play. I said, "He thinks this is 1902. He thinks because he cut the wires, he cut off our voice. He forgot about the sky." I looked at Sarah Jenkins. She was huddling by the fire. I said, "Sarah, where is your grandson?" She looked up, startled. She said, "He's in the back of my Subaru. He didn't want to stay home alone." I said, "Does he still have that Starlink satellite internet dish he uses for his video games? The one that mounts on the roof rack?" Sarah nodded. She said, "He never travels without it." I smiled. In the darkness, it felt like baring my teeth. I said, "Hank, go get the boy. Go get the dish. And bring me a generator from the barn." I looked back at the floodlights. I said, "Damian wants a show? Let's give him a show. We are going to broadcast this siege to the entire world." The old Honda generator sputtered and coughed before roaring to life with a noise that sounded like a chainsaw in a library. In the silence of the siege, it was deafening. I knew the men outside could hear it. I knew Damian Cross was probably sitting in his heated leather seat wondering why the old woman was burning precious fuel just to keep the lights on. He did not know we were not powering the lights. We were powering a weapon he did not understand. We were in the study. It is a room lined with books my husband read and maps of the county from before the highways were paved. Sarah Jenkins' grandson is a boy named Leo. He is 16 and wears a hoodie 2 sizes too big and usually communicates in grunts. But tonight, he was moving with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. He ran the orange extension cord out the window to the roof of the porch where he had clamped the white rectangular dish. He aimed it at the northern sky. Inside, he sat on the floor with his laptop open. The screen cast a blue, ghostly glow on his face. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide behind his glasses. He said, "Mrs. Galloway, the satellite is locked. We have a signal. It is fast." I looked at the screen. I saw bars of connection. I saw the world opening up again. I pulled a heavy wooden chair over to the fireplace. I did not light a fire. I wanted the room to look cold because it was cold. I sat down. I smoothed my skirt over my knees. I reached up to touch my hair, but then I stopped. I let the blood stay on my forehead. I let the dirt stay on my coat. I said, "Leo, how do we do this?" He said I can stream it to Twitch and YouTube simultaneously. I can link it to the local community page on Facebook. But Mrs. Galloway, are you sure? Once it is out there, we cannot take it back. I looked at the window. The floodlights from the mercenary trucks were cutting through the curtains like lasers. I said, "Turn it on, Leo." He typed furiously for a moment. Then he turned the laptop around so the camera was facing me. He held up 3 fingers. 2, 1. He pointed at me. I looked into the tiny black lens. I did not see a computer. I saw the faces of the people I had met in the grocery store. I saw the bankers. I saw the mothers. I saw the world. I took a breath. I said, "My name is Augusta Galloway. I am 72 years old. I am speaking to you from inside my home in Gallatin County, Montana." I paused. I let them look at me. I let them see the bruises. I said, if I look like I have been in a fight, it is because I have. Tonight, my ranch is under siege. Leo turned the laptop toward the window. He pulled back the curtain. The camera adjusted the focus. The screen showed the blinding white lights of the blockade. It showed the armored SUVs. It showed the silhouettes of men with assault rifles pacing in the snow. Leo turned the camera back to me. I picked up the deed from the table next to me. I said, "The man outside is named Damian Cross. He is the CEO of Terra Nova Resorts. He wants this piece of paper. This paper proves that the water under this valley belongs to the people who live here, not to a corporation that wants to fill swimming pools for tourists." I held the paper up steady as a rock. I said, He cut my brake lines. He poisoned my cattle. And now he has cut the power and surrounded my home with hired guns to freeze us out. He thinks because we are old and because we are rural that we do not matter. He thinks we will die quietly in the dark. I leaned forward. I said, but Damian forgot one thing. The dark is where the truth shines the brightest. I looked at Leo. I whispered, how many? He looked at the counter in the corner of the screen. His mouth dropped open. He said, 700. No, wait, 2,000. It is climbing fast, Mrs. Galloway. The algorithm is picking it up. I looked back at the camera. I said, I am not asking for money. I am asking for witnesses. I want you to see what is happening here. I want you to share this. Because if I die tonight, if this house burns down, I want the world to know who held the match. I kept talking. I told them about the history of the land. I told them about my grandfather. I spoke for 20 minutes. I did not use legal jargon. I spoke from the gut. By the time I finished, Leo was shaking his head in disbelief. He said, Mrs. Galloway, there are 40,000 people watching. It is trending on Twitter. Someone just tagged the governor. Someone else tagged CNN. I sat back in the chair. I felt suddenly exhausted. I said, keep it running, Leo. Pointed out the window. Let them watch the siege. We sat there in the dark, listening to the hum of the generator. Outside, things were changing. I walked to the window and peeked through the blinds. The mercenaries were moving. They looked agitated. One of them was on a satellite phone pacing back and forth, waving his free arm. Then I saw a car pull up to the blockade on the outside. Then another. They weren't police cars. They were civilian cars. I squinted. It was hard to see through the glare. Leo said, Mrs. Galloway, look at the chat. Look at the comments. I looked at the screen. The text was scrolling so fast it was a blur. We are coming. I am 20 minutes away. Bring blankets. Hold the line, Augusta. The people of Bozeman were not going to bed. They were getting in their trucks. I looked outside again. The line of headlights on the canyon road was growing. It stretched back a mile. It was a snake of light winding up the mountain. The mercenaries saw it too. The commander was shouting orders. They turned 2 of the SUVs around to face the road, but there were too many of them coming. It was the most beautiful traffic jam I had ever seen. Then the phone in my pocket buzzed. It was strange because the cell tower was still jammed. But then I realized Leo had connected my phone to the Wi-Fi calling through the Starlink. I looked at the screen. Damian Cross. I stared at it for a long moment. I let it buzz. Then I answered. I put it on speaker. I said, Hello, Damian. Are you enjoying the show? His voice was tight, strained. He sounded like a man who was watching his stock portfolio evaporate in real time. He said, Turn it off, Augusta. You are making a mistake. You are inciting a riot. I said, I am not inciting anything. I am just showing the world your business model. He screamed. He actually lost his composure and screamed. He said, You have no idea what you have done. The board is calling me. The investors are pulling out. You are destroying $1 billion project. I walked to the window. I saw him down there standing by his car. He was holding his phone to his ear, looking up at the house. He looked small. I said, You tried to freeze me out, Damian. But you forgot that heat rises. I hung up. I looked at Hank. He was grinning. It was a wide, toothy grin. He said, Augusta, look at the road. I looked. A news van had arrived. The logo of the local station was emblazoned on the side. A cameraman was jumping out, filming the blockade, filming the men with guns. The mercenaries were panicking. They were covering their faces. They were lowering their weapons. They knew the one rule of private security. You can operate in the dark, but you cannot operate on the 6 o'clock news. The commander shouted something I couldn't hear. The men started piling back into the SUVs. They were retreating. Damian Cross stood alone by his silver car. He looked at the news crew. He looked at the angry mob of locals pressing against his blockade. He looked up at my window. He got in his car. The SUVs reversed. They turned around. They began to push their way through the crowd, honking their horns, desperate to escape the glare of the cameras. The blockade broke. The first truck from town drove through the archway. It was a beat-up Ford filled with college kids waving a flag. I felt my legs give out. I sat down heavily on the floor. Leo turned the camera back to me. He said, "Mrs. Galloway, they are leaving. You did it." I looked at the lens one last time. I said, "Thank you." Then I signaled him to cut the feed. The screen went black. The silence returned to the room, but it wasn't a heavy silence anymore. It was the silence of relief. Sarah Jenkins started crying softly. Hank came over and put a hand on my shoulder. He said, "You are the craziest woman I have ever met, Augusta." I closed my eyes. I listened to the generator hum. I listened to the sound of tires on gravel as my neighbors, my real army, drove up the hill to save us. I had won the war. But there was one loose end left. One person who hadn't been in the convoy. One person who had started this fire. Jackson. I knew he was out there somewhere, watching. And I knew tomorrow I would have to face him. The morning sun hit the valley floor with a brilliance that hurt my eyes. The snow from the night before was melting, turning the driveway into a river of slush, but for the first time in months, the mud didn't look like a mess. It looked like promise. The siege was broken. The mercenaries were gone, chased off by a convoy of pickup trucks and a local news van that was still parked by the barn. My front yard looked like a campground. Neighbors were drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups, leaning on their tailgates, laughing. Sarah Jenkins was handing out cinnamon rolls she had baked at 4 a.m. I stood on the porch, holding a mug of black coffee. My shoulder was stiff, and I felt every single one of my 72 years, but I was standing. A black sedan pulled up the drive. It wasn't Damian Cross this time. It was Preston Hayes, the bank manager. He walked up the steps looking like a man walking to the gallows. His suit was wrinkled. He looked like he hadn't slept. He stopped at the bottom step. He didn't come up. He said, "Mrs. Galloway." "Good morning." I looked at him over the rim of my cup. I said, "Is it Preston?" "I suppose that depends on which side of the foreclosure notice you are sitting on." He swallowed hard. He adjusted his glasses. "He said I came to inform you personally. Corporate has reviewed your file. In light of the significant publicity last night and the discovery of the water rights deed, the bank has decided to rescind the demand clause. We are reinstating your original loan terms." He tried to smile. It was a weak, trembling thing. He said, "We value your business, Augusta. We always have. We hope we can put this misunderstanding behind us." I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. I said, "A misunderstanding is when you buy the wrong brand of coffee, Preston. Trying to steal a widow's ranch to help a billionaire build a golf course is not a misunderstanding. It is racketeering." I poured my coffee out into the flower bed next to his shiny shoes. I said, "You have 24 hours to transfer my accounts to the credit union in Livingston. I am done with you, and tell your bosses that if they ever set foot on Galloway land again, I won't use a camera next time." Preston nodded. He looked relieved just to be dismissed. He turned and practically ran to his car. Hank walked up the steps, grinning. He watched the banker speed away. He said, "You enjoy that a little too much, Augusta." I smiled. I said, "Maybe a little." Hank's face turned serious. He reached into his jacket pocket. He said, "I found this in the mailbox down at the main road." The flag was up. He handed me a thick manila envelope. There was no stamp. Just my name written in sharp, jagged handwriting. "Mother." My heart skipped a beat. I took the envelope. It felt heavy. I said, "Thank you, Hank. Give me a minute." I walked into the house. It was quiet now. The generator was off. The power had come back on an hour ago. I went into the kitchen and sat at the table where Jackson had sat just 2 nights ago. I opened the envelope. Inside, there was a stack of printed emails and a thumb drive and a handwritten note on yellow legal pad paper. I picked up the note. My hands were shaking. "Mother, you were right. I am not a Galloway." I forgot what that meant. I looked at the land and saw numbers. You looked at the land and saw a life. I can't stay. I can't look you in the eye, and I certainly can't look Hank or Miller in the eye after what I almost did. I am going back to Seattle. I am resigning from the firm, but I am not leaving you empty-handed. The drive contains the encrypted emails between Damian Cross and the bank. It proves the bribery. It proves he ordered the sabotage on the brake lines. It traces the payment to the private security firm. It's enough to send him to federal prison for 20 years. It's enough to bury Terra Nova forever. You won, Mother. You didn't need a lawyer. You just needed to be you. I'm sorry. Jackson. I read the letter twice. Then I put my head in my hands and I let myself cry. I cried for the little boy who used to catch frogs in the creek. I cried for the man who had lost his way. And I cried because in the end, he had done the one thing a Galloway always does. He protected the family. I wiped my eyes. I picked up the thumb drive. It was small, silver, and cold. It was the bullet that would kill the wolf. I walked back out to the porch. The sky had turned a deep, bruised purple over the mountains. The wind was picking up, smelling of ozone and wet sage. Hank looked at me. He saw the letter in my hand. He didn't ask. He just nodded. I handed him the thumb drive. I said, "Take this to the sheriff, Hank, and then take a copy to that reporter in the van. Tell them it's from an anonymous source." Hank took it. He closed his fingers around it tight. He said, "Consider it done." Then the first drop fell. It hit the dusty floorboards of the porch with a dark splat. Then another. Then 1,000 of them. The rain came down in sheets. It wasn't a storm. It was a soaking, steady rain. The kind that seeps deep into the aquifer. The kind that turns the brown grass green. The neighbors in the yard turned their faces up to the sky. They cheered. They took off their hats and let the water wash away the dust of the siege. I stood there, watching the rain fall on my valley. I thought about the deed in the attic. I thought about the emails on the drive. I thought about Damian Cross, who was probably on a private jet right now trying to flee the country, not knowing that his life was over. But mostly, I thought about the land. It was safe. The water was safe. The debt would be paid. The cattle would get fat on the new grass, and I would still be here. I am Augusta Galloway. I am 72 years old. I am tired, and I am alone, and my shoulder hurts when it rains. But this is my dirt, and I am still standing on it. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Here is a question for you. Jackson saved the ranch in the end, but he also betrayed his own mother for money. If you were Augusta, would you ever invite him back for Christmas? Or is some trust broken forever? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe that some things are worth fighting for, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.